morning, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live to the public. For those not able to watch live, the webcast will be recorded and made available for viewing on the County Council's website after the meeting. I have just received apologies from Mr. Innes, and there's no substitute for him. So agenda item 1, the minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of January 2026, pages 5 to 14. I move that these are taken, read, confirmed and signed. All agreed? Thank you. Item 2, question time. I've received a question from a member of the public, Mr. Walkley. The question and my response has been circulated to members of the committee prior to the start of the meeting and will be taken as read. This has also been published on the council website for public information, and I would like to remind members that there will be no discussion held on this. Mr. Walkley, good morning, welcome, has advised that he has a supplementary question. Before proceeding, can I remind you that your supplementary question should be to clarify the reply you've been given and should not raise any new issues. So would you like to ask your question?
My question is not answered. Does the council have an estimate of the costs to the council of Lutterworth East? 39.4 million has been spent already. How much more do the council expect to have to pay for Lutterworth East infrastructure? Just saying that more than 50% of the works are expected to be paid by developers could still leave the council committed to significant expenditure.
Thank you. Declan, would you like to respond?
Yes, Chair. So the question and follow-up question is obviously specifically stating regarding the cost to the council. As explained in the original response, it's expected developers will pay for the majority of the infrastructure. 50% wasn't used as a figure, do mean the vast majority. So, it's basically sort of bits and pieces would be expected to spend. So, but to give us sort of, I suppose, a bit of a better idea on a scheme this scale, regardless of who actually pays for the infrastructure, an estimate across all the different elements of infrastructure, education, roads, etc., would be sort of £150 million. It's that sort of scale of scheme, but the final amount will very much depend on the approach being taken to build out the infrastructure and also the timing of that construction.
Thank you. You're welcome to stay in the public gallery.
You've got another one. There are a number of questions.
Okay, sorry, carry on.
Question 2, the council only has outline planning permission for all works other than the Spine Road. So how can work commence without detailed planning permission?
Declan, would you like to respond?
Yep, so this is purely it's initial road access work. So this has been agreed with Harbour District Council as part of the implementation of the planning permission.
I asked in my third question if Lutterworth East is viable now. When was the last assessment of viability done? When is the next key decision point at which a new viability assessment will be made?
Declan, have you got a response for that one?
So again, per the original response, the last assessment of viability was during the changes to planning permission. So that was undertaken in conjunction with Harbour District Council. The next viability assessment is likely to be when we either get agreement with a government funding body to support the scheme, or we get agreement with the housing developers to progress the first stage of the residential development. It's that next key decision point that affects the whole of the scheme is when you do the full viability. It's not a cheap or quick piece of work to do.
Would you like to ask your fourth supplementary?
Yes. The fourth one is I asked for a start date for the road, and your answer is sorry, my question is not answered. You just say it'll be when the B8 will start. The Spine Road is inadequate as a Lutterworth bypass. Wouldn't a nationally funded bypass reduce the costs to the council?
Declan, you got a response for that one?
So B8, as with the other infrastructure, will go out to an external developer, so it'll be down to them to I suppose, schedule the actual order of the works, whether it's the piece of road first, the B8 sites, etc. So it'll be very much down to the successful bidder to schedule those works. In terms of the Spine Road, that was appraised to be sufficient for the impact of the development. That's why the planning permission was granted for it. And there isn't a nationally funded bypass that's been offered to the council that could replace the Spine Road. So it is still part of the scheme.
And your fifth supplementary?
That's it.
That's it. Okay. Thank you for coming in and joining us. You're welcome to stay. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to Item 3, questions asked under Member Standing Orders 32.1. I've not received any questions. Item 4, I have no urgent items. Item 5, declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Do any members have any other interests they wish to declare? No? Okay, on to item 6, any declarations of the party whip. Any members wish to declare the party whip? And item 7, presentation of petitions under Standing Order 33. I've not received any petitions. So we'll move on to item 8, member conduct arrangements, pages 15 to 24. Fiona Macmillan, the monitoring officer, will present this report. Before we begin, I need to make 2 brief but important procedural points. Firstly, members will be aware that we're now in the pre-election period, during which the council must take particular care to avoid discussion or publicity that could be reasonably seen as politically contentious, and this will include broadcasting any commentary on the conduct of individual members. In addition, national guidance and our own scrutiny framework are clear that scrutiny bodies do not act as complaints or adjudication bodies, and our role is not to consider or raise questions about individual member conduct cases. Those matters fall exclusively under the remit of the monitoring officer and the member conduct panel through a dedicated process. Our role is strategic, and therefore our focus today must be limited to the systems, processes and governance arrangements relating to member conduct and not to individual complaints, cases or circumstances. I would ask all members to ensure that any questions or comments are framed accordingly and are appropriately focused. If discussion strays into individual cases, I will need to intervene to bring it back into scope. So Fiona, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members. So I'm going to present the report on the member conduct arrangements that you requested earlier this year. So the purpose is to set out in a factual way the Council's ethical governance arrangements relating to member conduct. It focuses on the framework, processes and governance measures in place to promote and maintain high standards across the authority. As the Chair has just said, it's not a report about individual allegations, and it does not consider the merits of any specific complaints because that would fall outside the remit of scrutiny and would risk prejudicing due process. So I understand the Commission wishes to scrutinise how leadership should be demonstrated on conduct and standards across the organisation. So I'm going to start by summarising the formal standards framework we have in place and then go on to explain where leadership sits within that framework, because whilst the Council's executive does not shape the code or operate the complaints process, leadership on standards is still a shared responsibility and is demonstrated through behaviours, expectations, training and culture. So turning first to the framework itself, the Council's current local standards arrangements came into effect on the 1st of December 2021, and they were introduced following the Local Government Association's issue of a model code of conduct, which was developed in response to the Committee on Standards and Public Life's recommendations in 2019. It's the Corporate Governance Committee that has responsibility for promoting and maintaining high standards of conduct by members and co-opted members, and for overseeing the arrangements that support that. So as set out in the report, sections 5 to 6, the Council has a structured framework for promoting and maintaining standards of member conduct, forming part of wider ethical and corporate governance arrangements designed to support transparency, accountability and public confidence in local decision making. That framework includes the adopted Members' Code of Conduct, rules on interests and gifts and hospitality, the procedure for handling complaints alleging breaches of the code, the Member Conduct Panel arrangements and the role of the independent persons, oversight by the Corporate Governance Committee, training and guidance to support members, and the protocol on member and officer relations. So on the code itself, sections 7 to 11 of the report, the Localism Act 2011 requires every local authority to adopt a code of conduct that is consistent with the 7 Nolan principles, including the principle of leadership. It also requires councils to set out rules on registering and disclosing interests. Beyond those requirements, councils determine their own local codes. In Leicestershire, because some members are dual-hatted across tiers, the county and district monitoring officers sought commonality, and following discussion and consultation through a subgroup of the Corporate Governance Committee, the council adopted a locally amended version of the LGA Model Code, which is now part of the Constitution and sets out the standards of behaviour expected when members act in their official capacity, including expectations around respect, bullying, harassment and discrimination, impartiality of officers, confidentiality, not bringing the council into disrepute, proper use of position, use of resources, and decision making. Alongside the code, the report sets out the arrangements for declaring interest and registering gifts in hospitality. Members must register disclosable pecuniary interests and other registrable interests and gifts in hospitality above a specified threshold. Standard forms and guidance are provided, registers are published for transparency, and reminders are issued to support ongoing compliance. Sections 26 to 28 then explains the arrangements for handling complaints. Corporate Governance Committee approved the procedure for dealing with allegations of breach back in 2012, and it has been reviewed and updated over time to ensure that it remains fit for purpose and aligns with good practice. Complaints are initially considered by the monitoring officer and may be filtered at the initial threshold stage if they fall outside scope or do not merit formal investigation. Where appropriate and proportionate, matters can be resolved informally at an early stage alongside an independent person, often through an apology or similar outcome. Where complaints proceed, the member conduct panel considers whether an investigation is warranted and, if necessary, will hold a hearing to determine whether the code has been breached and what sanctions, if any, should be applied. The panel has recently asked me to consider refinements to the procedure to cover the scenario where a request for a public apology is being contemplated by the panel as an alternative to formal investigation. The panel would like a summary setting out the context and seriousness of the complaint to also be published at the same time to improve public accountability and transparency. So we're going to look at that going forward. The role of the independent persons is an important safeguard. Localism Act requires that the views of the independent person are sought before decisions are made either by the monitoring officer or the member conduct panel. They provide an external viewpoint and reassurance to the public that standards assessments are not simply members marking their own homework while remaining advisory and not decision-making. The report also describes governance oversight. The Corporate Governance Committee oversees the overall arrangement and currently receives an annual report from the Monitoring Officer on complaints received. I do intend to take an early report to the June Corporate Governance Committee on this issue due to the number of complaints received since the last report, which was made in November. It is important to note that our procedure states that where a complaint has been informally resolved without the need for a formal investigation, usually by way of apology, the identity of the member who is the subject of the complaint and a summary of the complaint will form part of this report to the Corporate Governance Committee, as it is considered to be in the public interest that these details are made public where there is an acknowledgement of fault on behalf of the relevant councillor. There is also an annual private discussion between the monitoring officer and the chair and spokes of the committee to provide added assurance on consistent application of the procedure, the involvement of independent persons, and any patterns or trends. Training and guidance are another key part of the framework. The report notes the dedicated Code of Conduct session provided to all members following the elections, covering the Nolan principles, expected behaviour, types of conduct that could result in action, and the link between the code, lawful decision-making, and public confidence. Additional guidance, including on social media, is made available via the members portal, and although training is not mandatory, the code includes a commitment to undertake training provided by the council. Finally, the report references the Protocol on Member-Officer Relations, which forms part of the Constitution and supports effective decision-making, political neutrality, and public confidence. It sets expectations about mutual respect between councillors and officers, political neutrality, appropriate communication, avoiding undue pressure, clear accountability, and confidentiality. So that is the formal framework. Turning then to the question you raised about leadership, I want to start by being clear about roles. The leader and the cabinet are not responsible for the content of the code or the operation of the complaints procedure. Those sit within the Council's governance arrangements, with oversight by the Corporate Governance Committee and statutory responsibilities discharged through the Monitoring Officer and the Member Conduct Panel process. But leadership on standards does not only mean owning the procedure. The Nolan principle of leadership applies to all public office holders and is expressly about exhibiting the principles in one's own behaviour and actively promoting and supporting them, including being willing to challenge poor behaviour wherever it occurs. So in that sense, responsibility for high standards is shared by everyone. Every member has an individual responsibility to uphold the code when acting in their official capacity. In addition, members in visible positions of responsibility and influence have a particular role in modelling and reinforcing standards, including the leader in cabinet, political group leaders and whips, and committee chairs. Leadership is demonstrated through the tone set in meetings and public communications, through reinforcing respectful behaviour and appropriate member-officer relationships, through encouraging take-up of training and guidance, and through addressing concerns early and constructively so that issues are less likely to escalate into formal complaints. There is also a wider organisational point which is relevant to scrutiny. National statutory guidance on overview and scrutiny arrangements emphasises that strong organisational culture is the key trait of effective scrutiny arrangements, and that this depends on commitment from the top, from senior members as well as senior officers. In other words, it's legitimate for scrutiny to explore how leadership across the Council contributes to the culture in which standards are promoted and maintained, even if the formal standards machinery sits elsewhere. So finally, the report also notes national developments which are intended to strengthen the standards regime. It summarises the government's proposed reforms, including the intention to introduce a mandatory code of conduct, to require principal authorities to convene formal standards committees, to introduce additional powers such as suspension for serious breaches and disqualification, and to create further review and appeals mechanisms. I mention this because it reinforces the direction of travel nationally as strengthening the framework and the wider culture of democratic discourse in a respectful way, and the Council will need to remain ready to adapt as those reforms are implemented. So in conclusion, the report provides assurance that the Council has an established framework for member conduct, a code which is aligned to statutory requirements and national guidance, a clear complaints procedure with safeguards including independent persons, a member conduct panel, governance oversight through the Corporate Governance Committee, and training and protocols that set expectations and reinforce good practice. The recommendation is simply for you to note the report, but I'm happy to answer questions, albeit within an appropriate and non-case specific scrutiny remit.
Thank you, Fiona, for that really good oversight. Questions, Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions, actually, if I may indulge. You mentioned the phrase you said, acting in an official capacity, and you mentioned that several times.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're here today, we're wearing our lanyards, we're at council premises. It would be arguable that we are in an official capacity. The same when we appear on radio or TV and things like that, we are acting in official capacity. But obviously, a lot of what we do now is online and social media, and I would presume that many of the complaints may have come through those sort of channels. Now, what I'm trying to get at is what is the defining line? When are we acting in an official capacity? Specifically, for example, if a member's social media specifically states that they are not acting in an official capacity, nor are they representing the council in any way, surely under freedom of speech laws, a member should have the right to say whatever they wish, as long as it's within, the legal framework and everything else. They're not acting in their official capacity in any way. So that's my first point. The second one is that obviously the sanctions that we currently have. Now, in many cases, I'm sure everybody in this room has said or done things that perhaps they thought, oh, maybe that's the wrong thing to do. And from my point of view, I've always apologised if I've ever have crossed those lines, both here and elsewhere. To be cost the council to go through all these different measures and things, and then we end up with a forced apology. You must apologise. That to me is not really a punishment, nor is it sincere. So my question there is, and I welcome the new legislation coming through. Can we do more? Can we, make sure that if a member crosses the line, that they are held to account for that within what we currently have? Because personally, I don't feel that they are at the moment. Thank you.
Turn myself off. So starting with the official capacity, so it is possible for members to put something on their social media which says all views are my personal views, not representing the views of the council. And that's fine. And that's certainly an indication to members of the public that they're not necessarily wanting to be perceived as representing the council. However, it's not quite that straightforward. So if they are talking on social media about a council issue or about the council itself or the role of the council or anything that would bring it within the remit of being a councillor, then that means that they are potentially acting in their official capacity. It's a case by case specific basis. I have to look at every post and look at the background and all of that. But generally, for instance, if a member posts on social media and it's about an issue that has nothing to do with this council or their role as a Leicestershire County Council, they are not acting in their official capacity. And that's the clear guidance, and that means that I cannot proceed with that complaint. So that's the first one. Second one is about sanctions. I completely agree with you. The sanctions we have are not fit for purpose. I think most people would agree with that. I think if you go back to when the Localism Act came in, before that, the standards regime had all the things that they're now planning to reintroduce in terms of disqualification, suspension, and stricter sort of sanctions that were available. And there was a national oversight body, the Standards Board for England. But any of you who were councillors at that time will know or remember that that was not always popular with councillors either, that approach. And there were a lot of politically motivated, vexatious and tit-for-tat complaints that went to Standards Board for England and made people very cross with the system. And therefore, the government at the time decided to change it, and they introduced disclosable pecuniary interests, which are set in law and which have a criminal offence attached to them if you don't do that. So if you don't declare your interests in the right way, that's very serious. And then they left it to councils to do everything else under their own, to adopt whatever code they wanted, which could just be a piece of paper with the Nolan principles and nothing else. And some councils did take that approach, and then others kind of replicated the previous code, and there wasn't a huge amount of change. And the view taken by the government at the time was that it was for councils to sort themselves out, and they essentially, unless it was a criminal offence under the Localism Act, it was really down for political group discipline to take any action. So that was what the feeling was at the time, and that's essentially where we are now. On behind these sanctions that we have, which are very limited, and there's no other sanctions available in law for us to take. Party group discipline is supposed to reinforce that, which works to a certain extent, but it doesn't work, for instance, for parish councils, and it doesn't work for independent members who don't have a party group discipline. So there's a hole in that argument, but nevertheless, that's what we've got. Mr. Piper.
Thank you very much. Just the one question, and it may not be one you can answer. In the projected changes where they talk about suspension for 6 months, that, depending on time, might mean that that member can't actually attend a meeting. If it's like a full council meeting here, it could be almost 8 months. But then they can be removed because they haven't been to a meeting for 6 months. Is there any idea, do you think, to get around that one?
I think that's a very good question. That certainly was something on the mind in the consultation. So I guess they would put something in that it would be just before the 6 month period, that 6 months, so that they wouldn't lose their right to be a councillor. So they're still working out the detail of it. But yes, that was certainly something that was raised. Mr. King.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, for your prompt through that. But just going back to the previous regime, when members could get suspended, yeah, there were. I was a councillor then. It was very problematic, which is why the government of the day then decided to change it, because there were so many appeals to the national standards body. I mean, it was taking like over a year for. Yeah, I mean, basically, it was all about timeliness. You couldn't get things sorted out in a reasonable. I mean, even now, things do take a very long time to resolve, but in no particular order. I suppose it comes back to what you've just been saying, but one of the things that concerns me is what I call repeat offenders. not just from members, but also from members of the public who, I know there are people who, I don't know who they are, but I know there are people who allegedly make repeat complaints about the same people in some cases, or just about everybody. And so I suppose what concerns me is what measures do we have in place to protect members from vexatious complainers, people who just basically pick fault for the sake of it, almost. And the other thing is, if there are patterns of behaviours that people are indulging in, what are we doing to address that in terms of training and support for those members to ensure they understand that what they're doing is, if they are doing those things, of course, continually or repeat in a repetitive way, how are they then being, how do we have a responsibility to kind of corporately support them? Obviously political parties will do their best, but it's sometimes that doesn't work very well. So I'm just wondering, what is there more that we can do corporately to support or encourage members to not breach said rules? But I pick up Craig's point. I think quite a bit of this is there is a level of confusion about when you're representing your view as a councillor, when are you representing your view as an individual citizens? Basically, are you on? It's the argument: are you a councillor 24/7, or do you have a right to a private life argument? And I think that would be helpful for some guidance on that, perhaps for all members. Thank you.
I'll start with the last one first. So on the official capacity side of things, I think it's certainly not evident to members of the public, I don't think, why somebody who has a social media account where they clearly identify themselves as a councillor may not have a complaint progressed against them because their post that they've complained about is not anything to do with the county council's business or their role as a county councillor. That is a distinction that I think members of the public struggle with. Nevertheless, those are the rules that I have to apply when I'm looking at complaints. No, you're not a councillor 24/7. You're entitled to a private life. However, the code is about when you're acting or appearing to act as a councillor. So there may well be councillors that, outside of their councillor role, like to say that they are a councillor in a particular setting, which then would invoke the code, even though it's got nothing to do with it. So if they were to go and say, "Why have you given me a parking ticket? I'm a councillor. Don't you know who I am?" That kind of thing. I'll go and speak to your boss and get this sorted. That's got nothing to do with their role as a councillor. Nevertheless, they've said that they're a councillor in that exchange, and therefore that brings it into the scope of the code. So it's difficult to delineate in any clear way. It's really on a case by case basis, but that's the starting point. It's to do with whether it's to do with your job or your job as a councillor or the council as a whole. So that was the last point. Remind me of the first 1 and 2 questions. Sorry.
Sorry, Fiona. Protection for members from vexatious complaints.
Yes. So we have a criteria document that the member conduct panel have to follow and work their way through at every assessment. And one of those is vexatious complaints. So if they feel that the complaint is vexatious or politically motivated or tit for tat, that's one of the things that they can decide to take into account at the time. And I believe that there may well be something built into the new arrangements that are forthcoming on vexatious complainants too. Having said that, it's not a particular issue here, certainly at the moment, vexatious complainants. And in terms of the frequent flyers, or what was the other expression you used in terms of the
repeat offenders?
Repeat offenders, yes. Well, I have and do offer individual support to particular members where that's needed. And we've obviously got a training programme across the board, and it's for political groups and their whips and so on to identify whether or not members could benefit from additional support in particular areas, and obviously we will facilitate that.
Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a veteran of many member conduct meetings of the last few months, and I've got to say, I think that it's cross-party working. I think has worked really, really well. Actually, we leave our rosettes at the door, and we're just councillors looking at it in a very open and you know, in a very honest way. My question now is around the sort of when the new more severe sanctions come in, which I think are needed, by the way, because I would agree that with the comments that a lot of what we've got at the moment is toothless. It's not an issue here in Leicestershire based on the experience I've had in the last few months, but I could imagine a situation whereby if you were putting a 6-month ban on someone, which automatically meant they were expelled, when that does happen at Parliament, so there's not unprecedented for this sort of thing to be in law, that actually in a different places that politics might come into that a little bit more. With that in mind, and with the comments Mr. King has made in terms of the amount of time it used to take, I don't have any experience of that. I wasn't elected before 2011. Is there any possibility we could have a local appeals panel made up, frankly, of non-councillors? So people maybe like the panel of the independent people, just to look at, you know, at whether a sanction is in fact too hard. So effectively like an appeals panel, but locally. Would that be something maybe we could do?
That is going to be, but if they're going to reintroduce suspension / disqualification, they are going to introduce an appeals mechanism into that, because in terms of natural justice, I think that's the correct thing to do. But the details of that obviously are still being worked up. But I think that's right. I mean, they did have an appeals mechanism previously. I mean, I've been a monitoring officer for many, many years and worked under the previous regime. And I completely agree. Some of the cases could take 18 months by the time they went through the national body and then an appeal function. So there was an appeal to a body called the Adjudication Panel for England, which was essentially like a high court for all things to do with conduct. And the process was a huge amount of time to hang over members' heads, so they didn't know what was going to happen. So, you know, that can't be right to introduce something that's going to take that long again. So I think that's why they're doing quite a bit of working up on it to see whether they can get something that was better than what there was before. It's difficult, isn't it? We all think that there should be more sanctions, but equally there are issues that go along with that, because you'll have to build appeal mechanisms in, which will make it potentially longer. So.
Schools.
Thank you very much. And it's a comment, really, but maybe a suggestion as well at the end. I think when it comes to that voice, that external voice, and the perception whether a councillor is or not, I think it's very difficult for the public, simply because if you have 95% of your content or 95% of your conversations around political content, around issues which might affect people, shape opinion, influence their decision making, you can't just turn it off with a 5%, expect it not to bleed over. And I think that's just any walk of life. Not just as a councillor, I think that's just human nature. If you speak about something enough, it's going to stick, and that's a pretty accepted thing. I do wonder, though, that the perception is a bit of us as councillors and our other council staff. I'm concentrating on that now, because obviously I'm assuming you have your own code of conduct as members of staff, and we have the Nolan principles that seem to guide us. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to bring those closer together, that the same standards we hold our staff to are copied over and lent to us as councillors, because essentially we're all part of one team. And I don't know, it goes things like the values of the organisation, of the vision of what we want to be as a council. And I wonder if there's more work that can be done to assimilate those and assign like a sort of align them together, so we all as one council have that same ethos. Because I think it is a little bit sometimes councils have a separate rules, separate sort of body or voice, and the people who work for us and enable us to do our jobs have a different set. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to sort of align those.
I mean, yes, it is two distinct systems. We have an officer code of conduct and a member code of conduct, but clearly members are democratically elected officials in a position which is slightly different from an employee of the council. So therefore, all of these systems are set up for members, and there's a different system which falls under the chief executive head of paid service in relation to any issues involving officers. what brings them together at the moment is the member officer protocol. That's the one document where we bring both member and officer behaviour together. And I think there probably does need to be a bit more refining of that doing. So it's something I'm intending to bring something to the next group leaders and then constitution committee, some amendments to the member officer protocol that will boost that protocol a bit more, and then that's then referred to by both officers and members in terms of how we work together. But yes, I mean, everybody should be subject to the Nolan principles and whatever the council's vision is in terms of working together as one council, but it is still two distinct routes in how we would deal with any issues. Dr. Bloxham.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to say I strongly disagree with the point that staff and councillors should have similar codes of conduct, just because, you know, we're political actors. We are going to say things controversial. That's part of being a politician. You know, we are going to have permission to speak more bluntly, and we're going to have views that people disagree with and large numbers of the public disagree with. That's fine. Whereas if a staff member was saying those sort of things, that would not be good in your day job. So I do think we need to keep in mind that the idea of freedom of speech and what our role is here. I mean, with that, I was wondering if we have any stats on the code of conduct complaints that we get, as in which aspects are being complained about the most and things. You know, like a pie chart or something for each one to get an idea of which is the big one. And then that brought me on to sort of bringing the council into disrepute is kind of something that, again, is going to be in the eye of the beholder. You know, a lot of these complaints are about reform. So, you know, some reform views are going to bring the council into disrepute for people who strongly disagree with those views, but they're legitimate political expressions.
Yeah, and freedom of speech is very important. Part of what the member conduct panel look at. I will always advise in detail on the case law involving that, and they're fully informed about how to do that balancing act between freedom of speech and also where that crosses the line into personal attack, which is where freedom of speech does not apply in the same way, and the code of conduct essentially takes over at that stage. So it's fine to have robust political debate, but where that strays over the line into making a personal attack on someone, then the code of conduct is entitled to supersede that, I suppose you'd say that. So yeah, it's very important that there's a balance between allowing members to do their job as politicians and running an atmosphere in the council where it's respectful and professional. So it's just about trying to do both at the same time. What was there another question there? Sorry.
The other point was about just whether we had any statistics on which aspects of the code of conduct.
Pie charts as such, but that's an interesting idea. I will see if I can do that. I mean, I could say just off the top of my head that it's mostly respect is the issue, and disrepute tends to come hand in hand with that, because normally if you are found to have breached the respect provisions, then in many occasions you will have also lowered your reputation as a councillor, which is what disrepute is all about, or the reputation of the council as a whole. So those two kind of go hand in hand. Right, Mr. Mullaney.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of people expressing sort of opinions which may offend people and lead to complaints, I do sometimes wonder whether sometimes the motivations for this is not because the individuals concerned actually believe these things, but they're actually saying things that some people would consider outrageous in order to generate attention for themselves. And partly through social media, if you express a sort of boring mainstream opinion, you're not going to get much attention. Whereas if you say something outrageous, you are likely to get a lot more attention. So there is that incentive for people to say things on social media that might offend others. And I do wonder if there is a regime which is too harsh towards people who express these opinions, that they may deliberately express an opinion which they know will get them into trouble, in order then to generate themselves more attention by saying, look at me, I'm a victim, I'm being oppressed for my views. And so there is always a risk that having a too harsh system, because some people are basically motivated by wanting attention and more publicity on social media, that they might deliberately try and breach such rules just in order to generate more attention to themselves.
If there was a question and then more of a
Not sure I
statement.
can comment on that.
You were close to the win there, so we'll leave that one there. Mr. King, you indicated.
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to just picking up Dr. Bloxham's point about statistics. I just wonder, Fiona, do you have any information about, or could we be supplied with information, not just this commission, but the councillors, about how we compare to other councils within our local area, i.e. Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, but also in our wider, comparisons, councils, across the region maybe, because I think that would be helpful for us to have a better understanding about whatever's happening in Leicestershire. Is that in line with what's happening elsewhere, or are we an outlier, both positive or negative, if you understand my drift on that? Because I think that's really important for us to understand. Is this just isolated in Leicestershire that we've seen an uplift in the number of complaints, or is it across the whole area there's been an uplift in complaints, or are we just, with, so we're with the pack, so to speak, or is it we're out of kilter and there's actually more significant issues going on underlying which need to be addressed? So I'm just trying to understand that, and I think that will be really helpful, picking up what Dr. Bloxham said about the type of complaints, and that would be helpful as well, I think. Thank you.
I can certainly have a look at that if from where other councils publish that information, because not everybody does do that in the same way that perhaps we do. Everybody should have some kind of report on the number of complaints, but I can certainly have a look at that.
Just a small reminder of members to keep their questions within the boundaries that we've been advised. We're a couple close to the wind. So Mr. Smith, oh no, Mr. Parlin was next, sorry.
Thank you. And with that advice very much in mind, I asked the question, how to do it within the bounds of what we're left. So obviously we have an equality duty as an organisation, public sector, and that applies to staff, that applies to members and members of the public. That there have been occasions, let me try and put this in a more neutral way. If a person says something online because they have something like autism, or or a condition that means that they don't fully understand the consequences of what they've put in the same way that a neurotypical person might do, is that something that is took into account in any way during the process? Because I'm aware, I've said it before, my eldest son has got autism and ADHD, and there have been times when I've seen things that I go, that's Tommy, and it's not him being cruel or anything like that. It's just the way the brain works. And as I said, that's as close as I can get without breaking over the boundaries. But I just wonder to what extent, I appreciate that maybe the public don't see it that way, but equally, do we have a duty to take those sorts of conditions into account when judging behaviour?
Yes, and yes, where we know about them, I think would be the answer, but we don't always, so it's difficult. But if I had that information, then yes, I would take that into account, and the member conduct panel would as well.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm finding myself in the spirit of cross-party working in agreement with both our Lib Democrats and our Reform colleagues here, because what Mr. Mullaney said there about people, some people potentially are looking at making more of a name for themselves online. I don't necessarily disagree that. I agree that that's a bad thing, because we are public servants. We're also public figures, and there's a difference there between the two as well. Public servant and public figure is a very, very different thing. And if people want to enhance their online persona, and if it gets bigger, well, that's great, as long as it's done in a constructive way. But I think I wrote a piece not long ago, actually, that a national publication. There is a more sinister thing happening behind the scenes with a lot of these accounts now are monetized, and they are not only making these comments for notoriety, but they're also making it for profit and personal financial gain. And that's something I think the council does need to address. I do not think that any councillor should be profiteering from their social media accounts that are linked to, in whatever capacity, to obviously their thing, and that comes from a capitalist. So please, there are two separate issues here. And then when we talk about, obviously, how do we police that? That is incredibly difficult to do, because we are twin hatters here. We are not at different levels of government, but we are, on one side we're councillors, but on the other side we are personal politicians. And certainly my social media is all about the politics. I want to get my political views, and as Dr. Bloxham quite clearly says, not everybody is going to, in this room, is going to agree with them, let alone the general public. So we need that freedom of expression. We need that freedom of speech to be able to put across our personal political opinions. And just because I'm a councillor, that should not be taken into account specifically. And I reiterate this, where you are absolutely making it abundantly clear you are not acting as a councillor, whether that's in your header of your social media, or whether potentially you could offer guidance that each post we put a statement underneath, almost like, obviously during an election period, we have to have the footer. That could be potentially something that you might offer guidance on as well. Thank you.
I have previously offered guidance on exactly those terms to a number of councillors. However, it can't be completely black and white on some of these. I think, as I said, you have to look on every single post on its own merits if I get a complaint about it. And just because something has got a disclaimer on the bottom of a post, it very much depends on the content of it. And if it's as you say, and it's not relating to your role as a councillor, but it's a political view generally, and it's got nothing to do with what you'd be expected to be involved in as a Leicester County Council, then that's fine. If, however, you're expressing a political view about something that is the business of the council, then that brings it within the scope of the code. Okay.
Okay, no one else has indicated. A couple of points from me. Do we have any timelines for the government bringing in these new standards?
Well, they issued a detailed paper just before Christmas, and I understand they're waiting for parliamentary time and to work through the detail because it's quite complicated. But so no, I don't have a timeline, but I would be hopeful it would be later this year, but I don't know.
My second question is about the speed of which complaints that have been put in here are dealt with, because I think we've mentioned that hanging over councillors' heads and things like that. So is there anything we can do to speed up the resolve of complaints that are coming in so they're dealt with promptly?
Well, we've obviously had an unprecedented level of complaints in the last few months, which I've had, which takes time, and every single one has got to be acknowledged. Emails about whether or not they're happy for their details to be disclosed at the earliest stage. So there's a bit of back and forth on every one, and then there's a process that has to be followed, which takes time, which involves me making an appointment to have a meeting with the relevant IP, all of that sort of stuff, and then writing reports to the conduct panel. And then if the conduct panel want an investigation, then it's appointing an investigator. That investigation takes time, and then there's a hearing at the end of that, which takes time to organise. So, I mean, all of that, it's impossible to do that in a matter of weeks. It will be months for something that has to go through the full stage through the process. But yes, so I'm ever hopeful that the number of complaints that I have on my desk at any one time will diminish dramatically, and therefore we should get back into a more normal state of affairs. But there is a little bit of a backlog at the moment, it's fair to say.
Are we able to quantify how much that's costing the council, or is it just because obviously do we pay the independent people? We have to pay for the external inquiry?
We pay them an honorarium. But we pay for an external investigator when that's needed. Yeah.
We got ideas of costs for an external?
Well, they vary depending on who you instruct. Some of this is commercial information.
Okay, that's fine.
It can, yes, anything from about £2,000-3,000 up to 15-20 in a very complicated case, which I've had before elsewhere.
So that is a huge cost.
Yeah.
To the are you able to share how many of those are ongoing at the moment? No. Okay,
I'm
that's
not able
fine.
to share that.
That's a huge cost, isn't it? I think something that we do need to think about. 1 minute. And then my last point is about training. Obviously, you did say it's not mandatory, and I just wonder if there's any.
No, and I think it should be.
And that was
So
my
maybe
point.
that's something the council would like to.
Yeah, so maybe we could put a recommendation to the governance committee that we make that training mandatory. And I think those councillors that are found guilty of breaking the code should redo the training again and make that mandatory. And I just wonder whether there's anything we can tap into, because training is going to help us stop this if members are aware of what they should and shouldn't be doing. I think that would be helpful. And obviously we're now members of the LGA again, and they offer a huge amount of resource there for members about conduct, but also the wider brief of being a councillor. And I think, political leaders should be looking into encouraging their members to go on training. So I think there's a role for us here to encourage more training. If we can make it mandatory, I think we should be.
Yeah, I'd welcome that. We could certainly bring that through to Corporate Governance Committee as a recommendation from Scrutiny. In terms of the LGA training, yes, we obviously recently rejoined and there's a whole wealth of training available. I'd absolutely encourage all political parties to put their members forward for training. And we are going to be offering a lot of training via the LGA app, and it is very good training. So I think that would be really good.
Are we happy for put that as a recommendation that we make this training mandatory to the corporate governments to look into? Is everyone happy as a recommendation from Scrutiny Commission? Yeah. Okay, Mr. King, did you want to come back on a point?
Yeah, just following up a couple of points I'd share with you. First of all, on the training, do we actually publicise members' training records? What training they've completed on our website? Maybe that's something we could look to do. And the second thing was, Fiona, I know what you say about live cases. You can't say how much they cost, but putting my other hat on for a moment of another council where I do know how much we spend, because that is publicised in reports to the Audit and Standards Committee that they have there, which is equivalent to corporate governance. Can we get a global figure of how much has been spent across all of these investigations, not just year to date, but in the previous financial year, for example? Because I think it is important that we do understand how much taxpayers' money is being spent on some of these complaints. And what you just mentioned there about potentially a case costing 20,000, yeah, and it can cost a lot more than that. I know that. So I think it is really important that we all understand how much money is being taken up by some of these cases, because at the end of the day, it's taxpayers' money. That's what I wanted to say, Chair. Thank you.
Yes, I'm quite happy to include the cost of it in my report to Corporate Governance Committee, and there that puts it in, shines some light on it. The one I was referring to, I think it ended up being more like 25,000, but it was a very long, very complicated investigation and took over a year because of the complexity of it. So it wasn't a normal one, but yeah, that's the top end of the scale.
Mr. Piper.
Thank you, Chair. May I ask, when you're talking about making training compulsory, are we talking about for people who have been complained against, or are you talking about for all councillors? And if you're talking about for all councillors, on what topics? Because the amount of training which I got the impression that's available from the HLA, from what Fiona's just said, there's so much available. And if it's all going to be compulsory for everybody, we're going to be spending all our days in training.
No, my point was about the member conduct, the code of conduct, that it should be mandatory for all councillors. And then if you're found guilty of breaking the code, you should redo the training and make that mandatory, was what my suggestion was.
I thank you very much for that clarification. I agree with that. That was the one which we had right at the beginning of the session. Yes, thank you very much.
And just to answer Mr. King's question about that, so if training was made mandatory, then I could do who's done it and who hasn't. That could also form part of the report.
Okay, Thank you, members. Thank you for staying within the boundaries that we were allowed to today. I think that was a useful discussion for everyone. So we'll move on to item 9 now, the rural strategy. Lucy Littlefair, the Assistant Director of Corporate Resources, will introduce this item. She's joined by Karen Frierson, Head of Strategic Property. The lead member for Resources, Mr. Fowler, is also attending. So welcome, Mr. Fowler. Good morning. So during previous discussions on the Investing in Leicestershire programme and the rural estate, the Commission has understandably focused on the financial performance of the portfolio. Offers have previously explained that the Council's rural estate is held as a long-term investment, generating relatively low revenue returns because agricultural rents are linked to the productivity capacity of the land rather than its capital value. Capital receipts are only realised intermittently, typically where development opportunities arise or surplus assets are sold in light of this. So I'd ask that today we focus our attention on the content of the strategy itself and the outcomes of the consultation on that. So Lucy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so the purpose of the report is to seek the Commission's view on the draft Investing in Leicestershire programme rural strategy and update you on the feedback and outcomes of the consultation that we've recently undertaken. So in the background section of the report, paragraphs 6 to 12, we provide you with information on the reasons why we own the estate, how we manage our assets, and the various different tenancies, with paragraphs 9 to 12 providing an overview of the estate in terms of its size, its makeup, value, and financial returns. And as the Chair stated, what we'd ideally like you to focus on is the content of the attached strategy, which actually sets out in terms of the future vision, key ambitions, and the objectives for the next 10 years. So paragraph 14 is where we include in terms of what the vision in the draft strategy is to create a rural estate, providing opportunities for people to establish thriving rural businesses, support the rural economy and local communities, and make an increasing contribution to the attainment of the Council's strategic objectives, whilst delivering ongoing financial benefits. We've included in the reports, also in the draft strategy, the various different opportunities that we see and the challenges, and then there's 4 key ambitions. The report sets out a number of different proposals. Ultimately, that the rural estate should be retained and maintained at its current level of investment, providing a range of nursery and starter and progression holdings, which ultimately will help people to enter the farming industry and build a sustainable rural business. Strategy also talks about restructuring the estate to maximise its potential, with an evidence-based management plan in place for each of our holdings. It confirms that we were going to have in place a rolling 5-year financial strategy and also introduce key performance indicators in relation to our management of the estate. And we've confirmed that actually in terms of the strategy, we want to review that at 5-yearly intervals, as well as taking a look, I guess, as legislation changes, as it does on a kind of feels like a yearly basis in relation to agriculture at the moment, just to make sure it's still fit for purpose and making any amendments. So in terms of the consultation that took place between the 6th of January and 13th of February, we reached out to a number of different groups of stakeholders, including our farm tenants and members of the public, and we actually held a face-to-face meeting at County Hall, which was really well attended, particularly by our tenants. And there were also various meetings with different stakeholders related to agriculture, as I've kind of detailed in paragraph 25. General public were consulted via a Have You Say page on the council website, and we also had a questionnaire with a number of different questions which we use for the various different stakeholders. So in terms of what the consultation outcomes were and our findings, there was agreement that the vision and ambitions set out in the strategy were capable of delivering its primary objectives, so that they felt that, yeah, we were focusing on the right things. There was overwhelming support for retention of the rural estate, but recognition that the restructuring of the estate would involve the sale of land and other assets within the portfolio. And this was accepted by the consultees. People understood that. They did point out that, the requirement almost for, funding to be made available from any capital receipts we make, with some of that coming back into the estate so that we can improve our kind of on-farm infrastructure. And that's all again linked to kind of, ensuring that those farms are viable. And viability, particularly for the meeting that I attended with our tenants, came through really strongly. Yeah, both viability for them as tenants and individuals running a business, as well as for the council. Significant, I think, there was broad agreement, I guess, around the proposed restructuring the estate, as also about making sure that we had farms that were suitable for people either wanting to enter agriculture, and making sure that we've got those kind of progression holdings as well, so that people could see, throughout our estate as to where they might start, and actually, in terms of our larger holdings, where ultimately, they might end up. They could see how the strategy and the estate contributed to the wider objectives of the council, and also were important in relation to the environment. Strengthening stakeholder partnerships was also seen as key. There were some really good examples that they used around grants, for example, where where some of our tenant farmers were actually, kind of quite knowledgeable about them, others weren't, and actually sharing that information amongst themselves, and the council taking a greater role was something that, came through loud and clear. And I think that fits with the other point about better communication. So we really wanted to test with our tenants, because, we didn't want the kind of whole kind of, big brother getting too involved. Ultimately, that's where their family reside, isn't it, as well as businesses. Actually, what's the nature of that kind of landlord relationship they're wanting? But actually, again, they told us that actually more communication and engagement with them, would be well received. So that's good. So ultimately, we took on board the feedback. We've made some revisions, small revisions. It would be fair to say I was quite pleased that the draft statute that we sent out, but I've set out in paragraph 41 where we've strengthened, I think, the strategy, which is around that improved communication, about awareness of letting opportunities for prospective new entrants, working more closely with colleges and universities within the region, and working more closely with our internal stakeholders. We've got that coordinated approach. And really, I'm just looking for any feedback. Would you take the final version of the strategy through to the ILT board and Cabinet in April? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lucy. Mr. Farrar, anything you want to say at this point?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Lucy. I think you summed it up mostly. I think from a lead member perspective, it's a really important thing that we've got with the rural strategy. It's become something that goes beyond the pure financials. I think in a difficult time for farmers, with cost issues and various things with central government policy, I think it's important that we look after our farmers in Leicestershire, but also because they are the guardians of our countryside, and ultimately I think that's something that all parties we can agree on, that we're proud of being a part of a shire. So to look after that by making sure that our farms are well kept and well maintained is important. But equally, getting the balance right is just as important. And I think it was refreshing from the consultation to hear that viability concerns were shared amongst tenants and ourselves from a business perspective on either side of the playing field. So no, I'm very happy with the results of the consultation, and I look forward to continuing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, members? Oh, didn't know who was first. Dr. Bloxham.
Thank you both. It sounds really good, and I like the vision supporting the rural economy and local communities. And one of those things is there's an aim to support new entrants. I just wondered what practical changes we're going to make to achieve that. I mean, I get that this is a high-level strategy, but it'd be good to hear some of the practical side of it. And then ditto really for supporting the council's biodiversity duty. What practical changes we're going to be doing to do that.
Yeah, it'd be fair to say that on both of those, yeah, we're just building now in terms of what that's going to look like. We've progressed. The nursery farm concept is something that we're hoping to take through to the ILT board, yeah, over the next few months. So we've been talking to kind of different organisations across the country, yeah, that have got something similar in place, and that we do it as a bit of a pilot, I think, within Leicestershire. Because there is that balance, and again, that came through loud and clear in some of the farmers that I was talking to about. You know, there is a sweet spot put about at what point, I guess, a farm is viable. You know, 200 cows. They were kind of, you know, giving me those kind of figures. So we've got to get the nursery farm concept. Obviously, what we don't want to be doing is subsidising that, yeah, too much from a council perspective or at all. So we need to make sure that we're setting it up as a sustainable, viable business from day one. But it's obviously, you know, size that, I guess, yeah, not too much for somebody taking on who may actually, you know, have only spent their time at college to a certain extent, coming in not from a farming background at all, coming straight into it. Or actually somebody who's just desperately, again, we heard lots of stories of people who are just desperately looking, yeah, for farms and really finding it difficult. So in terms of the nursery farm, we think we're going to do a pilot around that. A paper will come through to ILT board. And then in terms of the biodiversity, yeah, we took a paper through to the last one around our Broombriggs farm, and we're possibly seeing that as an opportunity as well, yeah, to be able to see what's the art of the possible.
Thanks, that's useful. I think we need more pilots. In government as a whole, more pilots, instead of just putting things through and changing everything, more pilots. Thanks.
Mr. Piper.
Thank you, Chair. A little while ago, first of all, may I say that the report is great, and I think that supporting farmers is phenomenal, not just because of profitability and looking after the land, but also for our food security. We ought to be trying to be a little bit more self-sufficient in food, as well as many other things, but we'll stick to the farming bit of that. The point I've got and the question I've got really is, a little while ago, and I think it was a little over a year ago, the tenant farmers received what was seen by then to be a huge increase in their rents. Now, on reflection, that was because the increase, there had been no increases for a number of years. So overall, it wasn't big, but it was a sudden whammy. Now, what I would ask is, first of all, whether that was particularly fair on the farmers, whereas a little increase every year might have been easier for them to budget. And the other thing is, by not increasing the rents for those years, the council itself didn't get the increased income. So by leaving it for so many years before putting up the rents, the council actually did themselves a great financial misservice. Presumably, hopefully, you've got plans not to repeat that.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we've discussed the situation previously, and is to kind of, it's factual that those rent reviews hadn't been undertaken previously, and we did then undertake them. And it meant, yeah, for some farmers, absolutely appreciate, some quite large percentage increases for them. Was that fair? It wasn't ideal by any stretch of the imagination, yeah. But we dealt with it all in terms of negotiation with those farmers, and actually we got a position where they were all resolved, yeah. I suppose what you've got is the assurance then going forward that that people have those rent reviews conducted every 3 years, so we've got a little bit of time. We're putting everything in place in terms of, that's part of the rural strategy about it, the most effective management of our estate, yeah, to make sure that we don't find ourselves in that situation again. And obviously, we look at the market at the time, and actually people could find in 3 years' time actually their rents are going down as well as going up, yeah. But I suppose we've now got ourselves into a position actually where those rent reviews have been completed for all of our tenants, so none of them should find themselves in that position going forward where they get such a large increase.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Mullaney.
Thank you, Chair, and I've also had my appreciation for the production of the rural strategy and for everyone who's put time into producing this. In terms of Leicestershire and specifically in terms of Hinckley and Bosworth, farming is an important part of the economy locally, and it's important that we do highlight the importance of it to our economy. And as has been mentioned, at this time of uncertain events in the world in terms of Russia-Ukraine conflict and various erratic world leaders and so on, having food security is more important than ever. And therefore, certainly we should be doing all we can to support the farming industry. And we do know, obviously, there's been some national policies around the family farm tax, which has also potentially negatively impacted on farming. So we need to support this industry. And I know in my own area in Hinckley, we have the Middlefield farm, which is an excellent example of a farm that does a really important work locally. So really, it's just to really endorse the rural strategy and to say that obviously we need to do all we can to support the farms in our county and ensure that as many of them as viable to survive as possible.
Thank you. Don't think there was a question in there. Mr. King.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the presentation. So what I want to got a few questions. So just on returns, talk about the returns increasing, but I'm just wondering, how does that compare to others that have other county councils that have farm holdings? How are we comparing to others? Couple of colleagues have mentioned about starter farms, and yeah, that's really important. But you also said about subsidy. Well, I don't think we should be subsidising these farms at all. If it's not viable, then it's not viable. And I think it's because at the end of the day, we don't subsidise any other industry, as far as I'm aware, across Leicestershire. So if we're going to subsidise at the cost of taxpayer farms, that would be a bit concerning to me. One of the things that does come to mind is, what would be the impact of LGR on your strategy and the land holdings? Are you having any active discussions at the moment with any of the other councils about the different permutations that might arise from, if I can say, North City South, or if Leicester the city got extended out to certain parts? I'm not sure, because it's hard to understand exactly where the holdings are, because they're just dots on a map rather than it's specific areas. Agree with Dr. Bloxham's point about food production. It's really important that we do have farms that are producing food rather than solar panels or wind turbines or pretty flowers. What is our strategy for? Is it to produce food, whether that's crops or meat? You've mentioned about the rent reviews are carried out 3 years. That's what it's supposed to be, so that's great. But one of the things I am a bit concerned about is, I mean, from a strategy, it seems all very nice and everything, but I think for me the devil is in the detail of this. But the other question I had for you is, it talks about disposals of some of the farmsteads and things like that. And so what I wanted to know is, what are you going to do to ensure that those farmsteads aren't just sold off to the highest bidder from London or Birmingham or somewhere who wants a des res in the countryside? What are we going to do to ensure that those farmsteads are actually made available to people who have either had a lifetime of working in the countryside and therefore by definition might not actually have massive assets to deploy to buy said property? So what are we going to be doing to ensure that those houses are actually made available for people who have devoted a substantial part of their lifetime to working in our rural economy, so they've actually got somewhere to live going forward? That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got 4 questions. Yeah, I've noted down, if that's okay. In terms of returns, then I haven't got information to hand in terms of how we compare with other councils. There obviously are fewer councils who hold still hold an estate, the size of ours. What we are clear on though is in terms of the market, that we do compare, in terms of the levels of returns. We utilise external advice from firms in order to be able to kind of ensure that as a property function, we've got that knowledge and understanding of the agricultural sector. So I'm, confident that in terms of our levels of rent, that they would compare in terms of the wider market. I probably used, in terms of the subsidise, I probably should have used the word investment. So when we're looking at setting up a nursery farm, what you want to be able to do is potentially take one of our existing farms, isn't it? Do a review of that farm, ensure that you've got the appropriate infrastructure in place for any individual who's going to take that farm on, because our understanding is that one of the largest issues for people, new entrants into farm, is actually getting the capital, to be able to get the farms established in the way they are. So what we might need to do is put some upfront investment in, which ultimately, will still, benefit the council overall. So probably it's investment rather than subsidy. Impact of LGR, it's just like those assets will be considered just the same as any other property assets that we've got, depending on the various different options. We haven't proactively had any discussions with colleagues in other councils at the moment, but I would imagine as soon as we've got clarity on the way forward, then we definitely will be. And then in terms of disposals, just with any other of our disposals, we've got best consideration as kind of what we need to follow. So I could never say whether somebody's going to come forward, to a certain extent, in terms of somebody from London wanting to buy one of our farmhouses, but that isn't how we tend to. Our land isn't normally used, just for somebody to come and pick off one of our farmhouses to live in as a residential property. We normally take a far broader view of that. For example, like with Leaders Farm, it's often used for a development opportunity for ourselves rather than for an individual to come forward and, as you say, benefit necessarily.
Mr. Poland, want to come back now? Sorry.
Yeah, if I may. Thanks, Lucy, for that. If I can just come back to the returns issue. Now we're members of the LGA again. Maybe you could investigate whether the LGA's got any data about this. I think that'd be really important. I hear what you're saying about market, but I do really want to understand how we compare to other councils that have farm holdings, because because at the moment I've got no idea. So I think we do need that information. Second thing is talking about disposals. Now I understand that, but this is being presented as a rural strategy. So what I'm trying to understand, what is the rural strategy on disposals? Is it, yes, it's just as part of the council's normal disposal strategy, or do we have a kind of sub strategy so that if there is a farmstead that we are saying, well, we don't need that anymore, it's surplus to requirements, okay? And because it's in the strategy saying there'll be a disposals, what are we doing to ensure then that people who have been tenants or have been working in the rural economy can, we're actually going to make those farmsteads or develop those farmsteads for rural residents rather than people to move into or develop into something else because we've gone to the highest money pays. That's what I'm trying to understand. If as part of this rural strategy, we've had any thinking about that at all, because one of the biggest problems is affordability in the rural community for workers in the rural community and also retired people in the rural community. They just can't afford to stay there, and then they have to move away, leaving all their networks and their families and everything else and move into a town or a large village or something like that. So that's one thing. And finally, the other point I'd got to raise is just picking up what you said about investment in starter farms. Can we just have some clarity about what the criteria are that the county council has for potential new tenants of our farms? Are they targeted towards existing residents of Leicestershire with a track, who've got a commitment to our county, or is it anybody can apply from anywhere in the UK to take on a tenancy, and there's no criteria and no points awarded? A bit kind of, a bit like choice-based lettings you'd have for residential property. The preference to people who've got a connection with the local area. Is that in our criteria for new tenancies, or could be grateful if you could clarify that. Thank you.
So just picking up the benchmarking one, LGA don't do benchmarking I'm aware of, but there is a kind of an association of kind of councils that do a bit, that do some, when the rent review stuff came up a couple of years ago, we did have a look at it then, and even though we hadn't done the rent reviews, we were slightly above average across other county farms. As Lucy said, the key bit is the market level of rent. That is what you sort of strike the agreement on. That's what the sort of both sorts of agents are looking for. So my expectation is we'll be sort of top quartile now compared to others on that. But that just stress that is on the revenue side. There isn't benchmarking on the capital side because it's so lumpy. But we can see whether that's been updated. I don't think they do it every year. But if it's a couple of years ago, we were a bit above average. But we'll have a look and see if there's any more up to date bits. Do you want me to do the development one as well? So the development side or the sale of farms, if it's a function in farm, the only reason we sort of sell them is if there's sort of a development opportunity, and then I suppose to give you a sort of sense of scale, the value of the farmland can go up by tenfold if you're going from just sort of using it as a sort of a farm into housing. So it's I suppose the scenario that you're concerned about doesn't tend to come up because it'd have to be someone sort of sort of buying a residential accommodation at 10 times its value for an entire estate than what you'd normally get sort of like normal kind of farming. It doesn't necessarily help with affordability either, because that's the reason we do the tenancy farming. That's in some ways why it kind of the strategy works for people getting a foot on the ladder, because they're not expecting to kind of buy a farm. Obviously, to buy a farm, you're talking kind of multiple millions of pounds. So the fact that we operate the tenant farmer setup is what sort of allows sort of people to enter into the business, as opposed to we're selling the farms for people to be farming. It's probably a very different kind of cohort. So I suppose hopefully that gives a bit of assurance that kind of the way it's set up by its nature helps with that kind of affordability. It helps with the sort of the entry and sort of first step on the ladder. Do you want to pick up the other bits?
Yeah, no problem. So in terms of the criteria for new tenants, then I'll just need to double check. Yeah, because I can't remember exactly what the criteria is that we use, and whether it includes you need to reside within Leicestershire in order to be able to apply.
It definitely doesn't.
It doesn't at the moment. You know that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Poland.
Thank you very much. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about getting new people into the agricultural industry who maybe don't have a background in farming. With that in mind, do we, well, first of all, factual question, apologies for missing it, but how many farms, sort of startup farms, become available yearly? Every few years, how often is that opportunity available to people? Secondly, do we work with Brooksby or any other agricultural colleges to sort of get people in, that are clearly already interested in the industry, in the ability to actually have a farm? Because it would sort of seem a logical first place to step. Because otherwise, before this meeting, I don't think I'd have had a clue how to go about getting a farm if I wasn't from a farming family. So clearly, agricultural colleges are for exactly that purpose. And actually, my last question's sort of been touched on. I think that when you get a farm, is there any sort of ability for the tenant farmer to then go on and purchase that farm, or is that just so beyond the realms of affordability that you're only ever a one generation sort of situation?
Yeah, no problem. Let's start with the one generation. Then no, we do see and it was actually multi-generational in terms of some of the tenants that came along in terms of, yes, sons and daughters taking on those farms, as their parents became more elderly, for example, or wanted to take step back. So that does happen. That does happen within Leicestershire. Karen's going to pick up the Brooksby because she's had the most recent conversation, with them, if that's okay, as part of the consultation, which was positive.
So in terms of consultation, we met with some sort of key stakeholders, including Brooksby, and they're very keen to collaborate with us going forwards. They themselves are just reviewing their own strategy at the moment. And in addition, I've also had some really positive conversations with the vet school in Nottingham as well. There's opportunities for research, teaching there to help in terms of supporting farms, nature and wildlife there. Then provide support around agronomy, veterinary welfare, etc. And in fact, a number of their students work in sort of local clinics and indeed on some of our farms in terms of placements. We also had some really good collaboration with the NFU as well. We're going to hold some joint events with them to support collaboration and information sharing, particularly with increasing legislation to help our tenants, farmers out there. And also similarly with the National Forest Company as well. That was also really positive to support tenants who are interested in developing potential agroforestry. There's also some potential good grant opportunities there may be as well. So, we're very keen to make sure we have that increased sort of collaboration with key stakeholders that can help us. And also it's something the tenants would really welcome as well. So one of the things that came out loud and clear was they would like some increased communication, and we're just working in the background how we can best do that to support them. Thank you.
Mr. Bull, did you want to come back, James?
Yeah, just in terms of how many farms become available each year. If I could ask what a supplementary to save me coming back again afterwards, do we ever get applications for, or would we ever consider applications from people who wanted to use the land for something other than farming? So if someone come along and wanted to make a holiday place, or wanted to make it, I don't know, paintballing, or because you're finding the farms quite often diversify now because of the nature of the viability issues. Do we have that, or would we consider that?
So we have got some of our existing farmers, who are already diversified. So we've got a llama farm, for example, and there's a nursery on one of the sites. So so absolutely, in terms of we would always look at kind of those opportunities as they arise and want to do, to a certain extent. But ultimately, the basis is about agriculture. So it has got to fit, if you like, to a certain extent, if we can. And then in terms of the how many, then it is fairly limited. In terms of you are talking one or two at the most. Each year.
Mr. Bulls.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy reading lots of this report, because I think this shores up this really important asset, not just monetary wise, but also for the environment, for communities, for especially rural communities and business and in the economy. I think my biggest concern is obviously that sadly, on a sliding scale of economy, it's always going to be more profitable potentially to give it to a developer to put houses on it. And we've seen that in Bosworth potentially, where land has come forward that could be part of a local plan or development opportunity. And I just wonder, is there an opportunity to go further and almost ring fence this land and say, we see this as such a significant asset, not just money wise, but actually environmentally and for our future because potentially as you fill all these in with houses, you lose swathes of green space across the county. And I've read through it, and I'm still not seeing anywhere where our priority is always going to be farms first, because it could then slips back and says, well, actually, we have to balance that with local plans and development. And I just wonder if we can be even stronger within this report and say, no, our priority is to keep this as farmland for as long as this council exists. And this is my concern, that we still have these channels open to turn this land back over to development or include it in local plans. And actually, for me, first and foremost, this should be farmland and be part of that thing we hand over as our legacy to the new authority, or to my children and to their children's children. And that's the danger. We lose that capability by saying there's always going to be a balance within that.
So it comes back to the viability point, really. If we were to ring fence it for farms, we'll only be making a sort of a roughly 1% return, which is effectively the council or the council taxpayer then ends up subsidising the farm estate. So to make it a viable proposition, so that there is sort of money, I suppose, for just the whole farm estate to work, you do unfortunately have to sort of sell off sort of chunks for development. To put it in context, though, it's kind of because that uplift we talked about sort of tenfold, you're not tending to sell off huge amounts each year. You only have to sort of sell off a relatively small amount of the entire estate to kind of make it viable, just because it can be so profitable. Sort of an individual farm can go for sort of 10-15 million pounds. So it's not a regular thing by any means. You have to sort of do the activity to get them teed up, but so that, I suppose, unfortunately, is a viability point on it. The other point, in terms of if you ring fence the farms, you then have an unintended consequence of making the development that does happen less sustainable. So you may be, obviously, if the farm's in the ideal position, for example, on the edge of a market town, you really want that to be where your development is. Sort of, I don't know, walking, you can walk to sort of places of work, etc., etc. So if you ring fence the farms, your unintended consequence would be that sort of suddenly development is less sustainable. So it's trying to find that balance. We do take your point. It's not just about trying to maximise the income of the estate, but it's trying to find that nice balance between kind of sustainable housing infrastructure, having a sort of a thriving rural economy, and the finances of it as well. So I think that's what the strategy is trying to do, is find that balance. But it's very hard to, if you skew it one way, unfortunately, you get an unintended consequence on one of the other aspects.
This is Knight.
Okay, just a quick question from me. These are our farms, and we're obviously keeping them going. What happens to failing farms that aren't in our portfolio that we would like to keep as a farm in Leicestershire? Is there anything that we can do to include? I know we've not got any money, but to include a failing farm that's, it could have a historic building on it. Is there anything in the background that if there is a failing farm that we can add it to our portfolio? Just a question.
Probably depends why it's failing, which I know is not the most helpful answer, but it's kind of, if it's failing, we've talked about sort of developing and maybe selling off bits of farm. The strategy is about trying to keep the estate at a sort of a similar size. So you've got sort of a coherent sort of estate that works. So there is going to be the potential in the future to maybe sort of pick up bits of farm. So if it's failing, strange phrase I'm going to use, but for sort of the right reasons, then obviously you would sort of consider sort of bringing it in and hope that sort of a new tenant could kind of turn it around. But we've ended up having to dispose of farmlands just because suddenly it's become a bit of a floodplain, and it's then just not viable as a farm. So it depends really what the difficulty is that farm's facing.
Okay, just a couple of points from me. Just on paragraph 21, you say about the rolling 5-year financial strategy produced annually. Has that started yet, or is that something that you're planning to start?
Due to start.
So that will come back here in a year's time. Is that what the plan is? And then just on, do we plan to increase the rural farm strategy? Sort of questions that we've picked on. Is there any plans to actively go out and look for additional land to bring into the portfolio at the moment?
Yes, that's always a discussion for the ILT board, isn't it? So it's a little while since we have increased in terms of actually purchased any farms, but I guess that's the role of the property services in terms of they're always looking for opportunities across the ILP estate, and if there was a particularly viable farm which came on the market, then I'm sure we would consider it.
And just my last point is, obviously you went out consult engagement with the rural farmers, etc. So is there any sort of feedback from what you've implemented from the consultation? Will we see any impacts or improvements in the rural strategy that you've fed into from the responses that you receive? Will we see any impact of that on it running better than it was?
Yeah, one would hope that with the overarching rural strategy in place, then that will give us the key focus that we need. Yeah, so they were at pains to say during the consultation, it's great having the strategies, but actually it's about what's going to happen on the ground and the action plan that's going to be in place alongside that. So yeah, so the strategy gives us that overarching framework, doesn't it, about the kind of ambitions and kind of performance indicators and things, and then that we're then going to hold ourselves to account against that strategy. And that's both from the kind of external tenants perspective as well as internally with the various different governance arrangements here.
And just my final point, sorry, is on about the providing areas for biodiversity net gain. Is there a profit in us doing that?
When we've looked at it in the past, it's fairly marginal. The problem is you're taking on kind of a 30-year liability, so you're trying to do a lot of guessing in the future. At the moment, it hasn't particularly worked because developers can choose, is it a local kind of biodiversity, or do they go up to somewhere like Scotland where it's much cheaper to do it? So at the moment, it hasn't worked, but it's probably fair to say it's still sort of a bit of an emerging area, and we'll sort of keep looking at it.
Thank you. Okay, no more questions from members. So the recommendation is the comments of the Scrutiny Commission will be recorded in the minutes and passed to the Cabinet for consideration at its meeting on the 24th of March 2026. Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 10, so the medium-term financial strategy monitoring report. So Simone Hines, the Assistant Director, will introduce the report, supported by the Director. Declan's still staying with us, and Mr. Fowler is still remaining with us. So welcome, Simone. If you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you, and good morning. Okay. So as you would have mentioned, this is the budget monitoring report as at period 10. So it focuses on the current financial year, so the 25-26 year. And it does show an improving financial position since the last report to scrutiny, and it's now showing that the council's forecasting a small overall sort of underspend of just under 700k for the year. That is forecast at P10, and then assuming that those trends continue to the end of the year. But now that we are, getting close to year end, some of those trends are feeling more certain now. The position that scrutiny received in the period 6 report was an overspend of 2.9 million. So you can see that kind of that improvement in the second half of the year. But as I said, that is still subject to change just whilst we finalise the year. That position does at this stage also mean that the use of reserves that we included when we set the budget in February 2025 of 4.6 million now won't be needed. So the improvement overall has meant that the budget can be balanced with that small underspend, and we've also we're not expecting to need to use those reserves that we originally budgeted for, and we have reflected that in the position that's in the report. The overall trends that we're seeing and that are sort of highlighted in the report are similar to those that committee have seen in previous reports and then we've discussed before. So children's social care, for instance, is still forecasting an overspend, and that continues to be because of increased number of children, primarily in residential care. What we have seen, though, is that there was a significant increase in demand early in the year that we'd assumed would increase to some extent. What we've actually seen more in the second half of the year is that it's more sort of plateaued, so we haven't seen any further sort of real increase compared to that first half of the year, and that's why the children's social care overspend has reduced. So it's still an overspend, but it's lower than we were forecasting. And adult social care demand is more stable and actually has been more stable pretty much all through the year, with the exception of supported living. There is an overspend forecast on supported living and some kind of high value packages there. And then you'll see through the report and through the various appendices that there are, lots of kind of ups and downs really across other services, and quite a lot of staffing vacancies, and there's also some areas of additional income. So I think recycling, for instance, we've got some additional income forecast there. There are also some capital finance and savings, because we have repaid some debt earlier on in the year, and I think scrutiny were already aware of that. And I think we've reported previously that we are expecting inflation savings as well, largely because of lower uplifts to social care providers because of inflation being lower than planned, and that is all included in that net position. Just touching on the SEND deficit, you'll see in the report that we are forecasting that to be in the region of 43 million this year compared to a budgeted deficit of 15. Now, there was an announcement in early February about government funding towards that SEND deficit. What we have done for the current year and in this report is continue our previous strategy of setting some provision aside for that deficit. But the headroom that has been created in the reserve from that government announcement was kind of built into the 26-27 budget position. So we're continuing the strategy up to the end of March this year, but then we have dealt with kind of the headroom created in the 26-27 budget that was approved by council a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's fair to say we are still awaiting kind of absolute clarity on how that support will be calculated. The government have announced 90% of deficits will be funded, but there are some caveats around that, and we're awaiting a little bit more guidance. That is, of course, only up to March 2026 as well. We await some further information about future deficits. And then just on the capital programme, briefly, you'll see in the report that there is net slippage forecast for the year of 28.5 million. Now that is slippage, which means the funding and the projects are still continuing. It's just a slight delay in the spend for various reasons. But we've already reprofiled that into future years, and that was included, largely included in the MTFS refresh previously. One of the examples of the slippage is the MMDR North East programme, and that's due to some of the weather problems I think we've had over the last few months. It's caused some minor delay to the programme, but it is still due to complete in May, so it's only a minor delay. I wasn't going to add much more, largely because I said a lot of the trends that are in the report we have discussed before, but I guess just in summary, the report does show that we are expecting to achieve a balanced budget this year without the need to use reserves. And I think, as previously, really the challenges remain in social care, children's social care demand particularly, and the SEND demand is still continuing. But we are managing the demand across children's services by with other savings and other efficiencies, which is enabling us to come in on budget overall. And that's all I was going to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. I think my overall take was this a more positive view that we're not going to have to use reserves for this year, but some really high risk areas are still sitting there bubbling away. Mr. Fowler, anything you want to add at the moment?
Thanks, Chad. Not a hell of a lot, to be honest. I think it's like you say, it's more positive news. An underspend of 700,000 is never something to be sniffed at, especially the fact that we're not having to use reserves, which is something we're really happy with. As you say, and as Simone touched on, the pressures are still there. But I think when it's demand-led, like it is with children's services, there's not a lot we can do about it. We're doing what we can in-house, but we await further clarity on SEND long-term beyond, as Simone says, March, well, this month. But yeah, overall, it's a pretty good picture, actually. And I think members should be pretty pleased with the report. So thank you.
What's Mr. Piper?
Thank you, Chair. That's better now. The microphone's on. Three sort of fairly short questions. On page 76, you've got two graphs there in paragraph 5, 25 and 26, which talk about the mosaic. I'm not quite sure of the use of the word. On page 79, paragraph 36, the shape of that graph is rather interesting, with little dips down and then a sudden rise at the presumably the end of at the beginning of every year. I was interested to see why the blip down and why always a sudden rise at the beginning of every year and not a constant, more straight line. And in paragraph 81 on page 86, I wonder if you could actually elucidate on that paragraph for me, please. Thank you very much.
Right, so in terms of the mosaic, that is it's one of the systems. It's the name of the system that they use in children's social care. That's hopefully fairly straightforward. In terms of paragraph 36, yeah, I think the reason for that's the cost, isn't it? Yeah, the reason for that sort of stepped increase is the beginning of the financial year when we agree the uplift. So we agree an annual uplift with social care providers at the start of the year. So that's why you see that increase.
Yeah, and also the dip down earlier in the year looks like probably about.
Yeah, go on.
The dips are the end of the year where it doesn't quite round to a full week. There's just a bit of a bug in the system, so it just creates this odd little dip. The best ignored, to be honest.
And then the other one was paragraph 81.
Yeah, I think that is in terms of, so in terms of our directly owned office estate, in the up appendix, I think you'll see there is a slight shortfall of income against the budget position for the office element of the estate, and it is I think we've got a small number of voids, and there's been a couple of units where I think we've had to do some additional work, obviously, which also affects the return as well. So I think that's in plain English, I think that's what that's referring to in terms of there's some pressure over that sort of sector of the portfolio because of small number of voids and some additional repairs and maintenance work.
Thank you.
Dr. Bloxham?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it looks good news, doesn't it? The SEND sword of Damocles is kind of not hanging over us anymore, and we've got a small underspend. Good. Just a question on the capital programme. The slippage, 28.5 million, seems high, but I've got no point of reference, so I don't know if it is high or if that's just pretty much what it is every year when we have bad weather and things. So I just wondered if you could comment on that. And if it is high, I mean, some of it relates to planning delays, which I guess are out of our control, but are there any lessons we can learn from that for the future?
I haven't got the exact details to hand, but I think we have had slippage in previous years that it has been at similar levels. And I think, as you said, some of the factors are outside our control. I think we have certainly had weather-related delays in the past, and sort of planning delays on some of the schemes. And I think there are, some of the big capital programs are reliant on a number of lots of different factors, many of which are outside of our control. And whilst the programme profiles the spend as to when we're aiming to do certain parts of projects, each kind of milestone can then be dependent on certain things, and so I don't think it's unusually high, but as I said, I haven't necessarily been back and checked all of the previous year's position at this point.
Any other questions from Mr. King?
Yeah, thanks, Simone. So first of all, in the report, it shows that Children and Family Services broadly is nearly 4% above budget year to date, was to the end of month 10. Are we expecting that level of increase in expenditure to carry on? And in particular, what I'm concerned about is what's in paragraph 26 and paragraph 29. And what I'd be very grateful if you could give us a firm number of how many children are being looked after and what the total amount of costs are for those children. So the first one is about the provision of placements in what I believe is unregulated environments. When we're talking some of those at the maximum of that, you're nearly talking £900,000 a year for a placement, and at the lower end you're talking 676,000 a year. So I'd just like to know, A, how many children we're talking about, and B, what's the global figure. And in paragraph 29, it talks about children who are required to be detained in secure accommodation by courts. And you mentioned, and the report says that some of the costs are in excess of £35,000 a week. That's £1.82 million a year. Could you please confirm how many children or young people are currently being required to be detained, and what is the total amount of costs that we're incurring for children and young people who are being required to be held in secure accommodation, and what the costs of that are? Because this is a very, very significant amount of expenditure. And I don't doubt the needs for these young people and children if courts decided that, but it does seem to me that seems a very excessive amount of money for the costs of keeping someone in that environment. So I'd like to understand that a bit better, if that's possible. And if you can't supply that information now, perhaps we could have a note after the meeting to just confirm that. Thank you.
I don't have all of that information to hand, Mr. King, so we will follow up with some further information after the meeting. In terms of paragraph 29, I believe we have 3 in that type of provision at the moment, but that may have changed since I last asked for an update. So I think it's probably best if we do get you that update afterwards. What I would add is that, as it says in that paragraph, they are court-ordered placements, and that's why we do have to provide them. And often they do have very kind of intensive staff to child ratios. But again, we'll follow that up with some further information afterwards, I think.
Any other rules?
Just to help Mr. King there, I think some of that information was actually in the last Children and Family Scrutiny Committee. I think those numbers sound about right if my memory is right.
And there are very few and far between secure accommodation, so they're in very high demand, so you get charged an extortionate amount of money to house a child there. Did you want to come back?
I did, Chair, because if we've got 3 children, that's £6 million a year, broadly speaking. That's costing the taxpayers of Leicestershire, because the courts decided those children, for obviously reasons that won't be disclosable, required to be held in secure accommodation. So what I'd like to understand is why if it's what are we doing to address those costs in terms of I understand the market and it's very expensive, but what are we doing to work with other council colleagues across the council, the public sector family, to try and address these costs and drive these costs down with government? Because I think this, it's just a rip-off basically. I think there's no finer words to describe it, and taxpayers are getting ripped off. So what I want to know is what we're going to do about it, because when you start adding up these different blocks of very small numbers, incredibly small numbers of children and young people, it's costing a great deal of taxpayers' money, which then means other services are denuded funding basically in order to pay for these very small number of children, which we don't actually know why they're there. I mean, obviously that's very difficult. I understand that, but I'm not saying they should, if they shouldn't be looked after, because obviously they have to be, because the court said that. But equally, it's not a bottomless pit, and if you're going to address costs, this is where we need to start addressing some of the costs that the council taxpayer is paying in Leicestershire, in my mind. Thank you.
Maybe that's a question we can put to the lead member for Children and Families. Response to the Scrutiny Commission, is that something we can do? Or we could put those questions to the lead member to ask for him what he's doing to put these costs if Scrutiny happy. Mr. Fowler?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that'd be a good idea. But just to speak briefly on the lead member's behalf, because obviously I've had conversations with him within East Midlands councils. I think there are extensive conversations going on with our opposite numbers in different organisations, different lead members for children and family services, and I think that is the intention, and that is the conversations that are going on, is they are trying to pressure central government, because frankly, as you alluded to, Chair, we are just held at gunpoint by the price mechanism, in the sense that they are few and far between, these provisions. We are finding ourselves having to go out of the county sometimes to provide these secure accommodations. So that kind of illustrates how few and far between they are. So yes, the cost is astronomical, but unfortunately we don't have a choice. We don't get to dictate how much they cost. It's a case of supply and demand. But yes, I mean, the nature of how available those provisions are, it's something that's being worked on. But yeah, I'm sure the lead member can elaborate on that better than I can.
And I think it would be good to understand if we can ask a question. I know when I was previous lead member, they tended to be in Scotland, but then you have the travel costs of the social worker, because there's still our responsibility of having to fly up to Scotland to work with the child up in Scotland in the secure accommodation. So it's not ideal. So yeah, there is work, but we'll send a letter to Mr. Bugsy and ask. Mr. Poland.
Thank you. Yeah, just following up on this conversation about paragraph 29, it says, excuse me, it says in excess of 35,000 has been said. Historically, the upper limits were no more than 15,000. What, in this context, what does historically mean? Is it like in the last few years? Is this 30 years ago? Do you see what I mean? How far back are we going in terms of historically? And again, without the risk of going into sort of the children and families element of this, what sort of challenging issues are we talking? Are we talking behavioural? Are we talking profound disability, or what? And I guess as a consequence of that, if we are being held to ransom by the market, and presumably this is a problem nationally, is there any potential to sort of work with other councils to create provision at a more reasonable cost?
These are generally children that are at risk of harm to themselves or to others. But we will ask the lead member to ask the other question about what we're doing to provide local provision, or what more we can do to provide local provision. So we'll get the answer from the lead member. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I have a few myself. Yep.
I'll have to go back and check that for you, Mr. Polo. Again, we'll include that in the note that we circulate.
I don't recall it being long ago. I would say within the last 5 years. I think it's gone. Yeah, so it's not years ago. It's fairly recent, historic. Yeah. So, but we'll get the right answer for you. Okay, just mine is on paragraph 9 about the underspend in early years of 5.9 million. Now that seems to happen every single year. So that's the government grant. So do we keep that money, or does it go back to the government? And if we keep that money, what are we spending that additional money on? Because it kind of reads here that we're just offsetting the high needs block funding with that early years block, whereas that money should be spent on early years children.
So at the moment, as you've said, the net unspent forecast is that the 5.9 million. But further down in the report at paragraph 18, we are expecting an adjustment to that figure of about 4.6. So that underspend will come down significantly before the end of the year. I think the accounting arrangements around the early years block is quite complicated, and we have to show it gross in that way rather than netting off what we expect the adjustment to be. But it largely comes about because of the kind of timing mismatch between assumptions that DFE make around take up and then the actual take up and the census data that I think lags behind as well. So we are expecting that underspend to come down significantly by year end, and we've estimated what we think that will be, but we won't know for sure until that final census adjustment, which doesn't come until beyond year end. And we do have this issue every year, so we have these sort of adjustments that then corrects the under or overspend post year end. Just a quirk of the system.
So under your estimate, we'd still have 1.3 million if those figures come off that is an underspend in early years. So what are we doing with that additional money that isn't paid back to government?
So there's some of that can be used towards our central costs. So if demand is increasing, there will be some of our own central costs that we need to cover. The early years block is ring fenced in the same way that the other blocks are. So it would need to be spent on kind of early years related expenditure. But again, I guess that would be for the service to determine what the priorities are from that underspend once we're clear what it is at year end.
Okay. And then on to paragraph 13. A little bit there about the TISA program that's now gone into, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's merged into something else. It does say there that was part of the Newton Europe work that we did back in August 2022. So I know Newton are back in doing the efficiency review. So they re-looking at this area as well again, or is that not included in the efficiency review because they've already looked to that area?
It was two reasons. One, like you say, because I'd looked at it very recently, but also in waiting for the government's white paper, we did take it out of scope, so it's not in the current review.
Thank you. And then just paragraph 15. Let's talk about an overspend in the high needs funded specialist teaching services. Are they the posts that we're looking to remove now? Specialist teaching service.
I'll have to double check that for you, Ms. Taylor. I'm not sure their posts that are being removed. I thought it was more changes to the posts and the T's and C's rather than removing them. But let me come back to you on that then. We'll double check that.
Thank you. Any other questions from members? Okay, so the recommendation is we're asked to note and comment, which we have done on the update provided. So item 11, the date of the next meeting is the Commission scheduled to take place on the 18th of March, which is an additional meeting look at LGR, I'm informed. So item 12, as previously advised, I've no urgent items. So that brings the meeting to a close. Thank you very much, everyone.